The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is heroes of faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you.
It is past 11 o'clock at night, and a man is lying on the earthen floor of a small hut, waiting to die. The heat is unbearable. His stomach is on fire. A book on medicine lies open beside him where his fingers stopped on the fatal line, the line that told him too late that what he had eaten was poison, and that 3 seeds are enough to kill a man. He has eaten at least 6. Outside, a thunderstorm has torn open the African night, and the rain hammers the flimsy roof like something alive trying to get in. His servants have gathered around him in the darkness, but one by one they have fallen asleep, and he has to keep rousing them, shaking them awake with a hand that is already trembling, begging them to keep the warm cloths pressed against his body so that he does not slip away unnoticed in the dark. He has already done the only 3 things left to a dying man in the middle of a continent where there is no doctor for 1,000 miles. He has written the cause of his death carefully in his logbook, so that whoever finds his body will know. He has swallowed the strongest medicine he carries. And then he has done the last thing, the thing that tells you everything about who this man is. He has commended himself, and his work, and the people he came to save, into the hands of God. And then he has lain down on the floor of the hut to die. He does not die that night. 6 days later he will walk back into the court of the king he has come to serve, so wasted and hollow-cheeked that the king himself will look at him and call him a skeleton. And this man, who has just stared death in the face over a handful of seeds he ate by mistake, will write in his journal that the shadow has gone back on his dial, the way it went back for King Hezekiah, and that surely God still has work for him to do. His name was Alexander Mackay. And before this story is over, he will bury nearly every friend he ever made in Africa. He will watch a king turn from a listener into a butcher. He will hear of 30 young believers being burned alive in a single fire for the crime of loving Jesus. He will be left alone, again and again and again, until he is the last man standing of a company of 8. And through 14 years of fever, and shipwreck, and heartbreak, and open graves, he will refuse, absolutely refuse, to leave his post. This is his story. And it is a story God wrote to stir something in you that has gone to sleep. To understand how a man ends up dying on a hut floor in the heart of Africa, you have to go back to a small stone village in the north of Scotland, to a place called Riney, tucked away in an obscure corner of the county of Aberdeen. It was there, on the 13th of October in the year 1849, that Alexander Mackay first saw the light of day. His father was a minister of the Free Church, a scholar, a man of real ability, who could not do much visiting through the brutal Scottish winters and so poured himself instead into books and into his son. And what a son he had to pour himself into. The boy could read the New Testament with fluency at 3 years of age. By the time he was 7, his school books were not children's stories but Milton's Paradise Lost, and Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and histories of Europe and of the discovery of America. He walked everywhere at his father's side, and the villagers still remembered years later how the 2 of them would stop dead in the middle of the road, and how the father would take his walking stick and draw shapes in the dust, sketching out a proposition of geometry, or tracing the supposed course of the river Zambezi, or drawing the elliptical path of the planets, right there on the ground. In that way the boy soaked up an astonishing amount of knowledge about everything under the sun. But then something changed in him, the way it changes in a lot of clever boys. Somewhere between the ages of 11 and 13, nature asserted itself, and the boy who had devoured books almost threw them away. Now he wanted machines. He wanted to see how things worked. He would walk 4 miles to the railway station and 4 miles back again, just for the chance of a good long look at the engine while the train paused for a minute or 2 on its way to Hentley. His favorite haunts became the village blacksmith's forge, the gasworks, the carding mill, the little shops of the carpenter and the saddler. He learned to set type on a little printing press of his own. He learned map drawing so precise that visiting men of science marveled at it. He learned photography. On Saturdays in Aberdeen, when other boys were off on excursions into the countryside, he was slipping into the great shipbuilding yards to watch the workmen build iron ships. His parents, who had dreamed he would become a minister, were quietly heartbroken by all of this. They could not see what any of it was for. They could not see it, but God could. Because every one of those skills, the engine and the forge and the printing press and the shipyard and the surveyor's instruments, every single one of them was a thread God was weaving into the fabric of a man he was preparing for a work that had not yet been dreamed of, on the shores of a lake that no European had yet seen. And then, in the early summer of 1865, the boy suffered the loss that broke his heart and, in breaking it, opened it. His mother died. And it was through that grief that he first felt, as his sister put it, the warmth of divine love reaching into his soul. As his mother lay dying, she was heard praying for this boy more earnestly than for any of her other children, because she feared that his brilliance and his charm might become a snare to him and lead him away from God. He was the only one of the children not at home when she died. And so she gave a solemn charge to a relative at her bedside. She said, when he comes to the funeral, give him my Bible, her own husband's wedding gift to her, and write in it the passages I want him to study, and give him my dying message. And the message was this: search the scriptures. Not merely read them. Search them. He came home for the funeral, and they placed his mother's Bible in his hands, and they gave him her dying words. And from that day forward, the Bible became the greatest treasure this young man owned. Years later, writing from the heart of Africa, he would remember it. He would tell how it was partly his own curiosity, and partly the memory of his dear mother's dying charge to search the scriptures, that drove him deeper and deeper into the Word of God, until, in his own words, from curiosity and criticism God led him to see the beauty of his own Word, and applied it to his heart. There is a lesson here, right at the very start, and it is one worth stopping for. A mother's prayers do not die when she does. A dying woman in a Scottish manse whispered her son's name to God more than any other, and feared for his soul, and pointed him to one book. And that whispered prayer followed him across oceans and down rivers and into the courts of kings, and it did not return void. If you are praying for someone, and it seems to you that nothing is happening, remember Mackay's mother. She never lived to see what her son became. But heaven kept the account. The young man grew, and the twin fires in him grew with him. There was the fire of the engineer, the man who had to know how everything worked and could turn his hand to anything. And there was the fire of the believer, the man who could not rest. He trained at the Free Church College in Edinburgh, coming out at the very top of Scotland among his fellow students. He studied engineering and higher mathematics and natural philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, and he was so hungry for practical skill that he would put on a blue workman's smock in the afternoons and go down to the engineering works and stand at the lathe, turning and fitting and building real machinery with his own hands, and then spend his evenings at lectures on chemistry and geology. And through all of it, Sunday was never a day of idleness for him. He taught in the ragged schools, in the mission halls, among the poorest children of the city. And then, in November of 1873, he went to Germany, to Berlin, to master the language and to work as an engineer. He quickly rose to become the head of the locomotive department at a great engineering works that employed 1,000 men. He was designing steam engines and locomotives. He invented an agricultural machine that won first prize at an exhibition. By every worldly measure, this brilliant young Scot was on his way to a comfortable and celebrated career. But something was burning in him that a locomotive could not satisfy. In that Berlin drawing office, he was surrounded by men who mocked God, men who blasphemed the name of Christ in terms so dreadful, he wrote, that it made him shudder to hear them. And in the middle of that spiritual desert, he was reading his Bible, and he was becoming convinced of something that would define the rest of his life. He wrote it down like a creed. He said there is no consistent middle ground between reckless atheism and the intensest warmth of religious zeal. If Christianity is worth anything, he said, it is worth everything. If it calls for any measure of zeal and warmth, then it will justify the utmost degree of these. Do you hear that? If Christianity is worth anything, it is worth everything. That is the sentence that made Mackay who he was. That is the sentence that would carry him into a grave in the African bush. Most of us live our whole lives trying to find a comfortable middle, a Christianity that costs us a little but not too much, that asks for some of us but not all of us. Mackay looked at that comfortable middle and called it what it was. He called it a lie. He said there is no such thing. And about that same time, a great man died far away in the heart of Africa. David Livingstone. And on the anniversary of his death, Mackay wrote in his diary in Berlin the words that had been written on Livingstone himself. A Scotchman and a Christian, loving God and his neighbor, in the heart of Africa. Go thou and do likewise. And then he prayed a prayer that God would answer to the letter. He wrote, "My heart burns for the deliverance of Africa." At first he thought of Madagascar. He offered himself, he studied the language, he waited. But God was steering him somewhere else. Because just then, the explorer Henry Stanley published a famous letter in a London newspaper, describing his visit to a powerful African king named Mutesa, who ruled a kingdom called Uganda on the shores of a vast inland sea called the Victoria Nyanza, and Stanley threw down a challenge to all of Christian Europe: send missionaries to this king. And when Mackay saw that challenge, something in him answered it. He remembered how Livingstone had first thought of Africa but been sent to India, and how others had planned for one field and been led to another, and he said, "Perhaps the Lord means me, after all, to turn my attention to the dark continent." The Church Missionary Society accepted him. And in the spring of 1876, a small company of 8 men prepared to sail for Central Africa on the very first missionary expedition to the Victoria Nyanza. Before they left, the committee gathered to take leave of the outgoing missionaries, and each man was called on to say a few words, as the custom was. Mackay was the youngest but one, and he was called on last. And what he said that day, men remembered for the rest of their lives. He said, "There is one thing my brothers have not said, which I want to say. I want to remind the committee that within 6 months they will probably hear that one of us is dead." The words were so startling that a silence fell over the whole room, a silence that could be felt. And then he went on. "Is it at all likely," he said, "that 8 Englishmen should start for Central Africa, and all of them be alive 6 months later? One of us at least, and it may be I, will surely fall before that. But," he added, "this is what I want to say. When that news comes, do not be cast down. Send someone else immediately to take the vacant place. Sit with that for a moment. Here is a young man, in the flower of his life, with a brilliant career behind him that he is walking away from, standing before the people sending him out, and the thing he is most concerned to say is not spare us, or protect us, or count the cost. It is this: when I die, and I probably will, do not stop. Fill the gap. Keep going. Send the next man." He had already, in his heart, laid down his life. He was not going to Africa hoping to survive. He was going as a man who had already died so that others might live. And his own words came true beyond anything he could have known. Within a short space of years, of that original band of 8, he would be the only one left alive in Africa. The journey itself nearly finished them all before they ever reached Uganda. They sailed from Southampton, and Mackay's last letter home ended with a request that was really a prayer, that grace might be given him to keep steadily in view the one great object. They reached Zanzibar, off the east coast. And then the dying began. Almost at once, the sickness took hold. Mackay and Lieutenant Shergold Smith went up a river called the Wami to explore it, not knowing that the people along its banks were cannibals. Smith went down with fever again and again, so weak at last that he could not even sit up. On the way back, their little cedar boat, the Daisy, was swamped by the waves off the coast, and in the wreck Mackay lost the outer pages of his own journal to the sea, only for them to wash ashore days later and be sent back to him by a friendly local sultan. He got the sick man to shelter, chartered a native boat at midnight, and lay down cold and wet and hungry among the cargo in a filthy hold. That was the first taste of what Africa would demand. Then came the fever that would haunt him for the rest of his days. They called it the African giant, the mukunguru, the remittent fever that we now know as malaria, and it threw him down 3 and 4 times over. He grew so weak that he described himself as having the strength of an infant. He was nursed back from the edge more than once by kind strangers. And when he recovered, he did the most extraordinary thing. He went back to work building a road. Because the mission had a plan that was almost insane in its ambition. They meant to carry a steam engine and a boiler, piece by piece, into the interior of Africa, to build a boat on the Great Lake. And Mackay, the engineer, with a working gang of only about 40 men armed with the best American axes he could buy, set out to cut a wagon road through the trackless bush of East Africa. Through dense, thorny jungle so tangled that a cat could scarcely creep through it, he slashed a path broad enough for the largest wagons to pass each other. He bridged the ravines, felling great trees for girders, driving in a donkey's load of iron nails, and where the wood was too hard for the nails, binding it with rope of coconut fiber. In a single month, ravaged by fever, he prepared 50 miles of clear wagon road where there had never been anything but a wriggling footpath. All told, he drove that road more than 200 miles into the continent, the first engineering highway into the heart of Africa. And every mile of it he offered up to God. He wrote that when he cut down the densest thicket, the story of the big road of the white man would be told around the fires at evening for miles around. And he wrote something else, something that shows you the fire that never went out in him even while he swung an axe. He wrote that he would not cease to toil until the story of the cross of Christ was printed in the language of that land, and every man taught to read it and to believe it too. Picture him. Every day covered in mud, his hands black as a sweep's, yelling himself hoarse at teams of oxen until the forest rang, wading through marsh for days on end, eating coarse maize porridge that he said tasted like sawdust and ashes, sleeping in a cow byre, a hen house, a hut no bigger than a dog kennel, or in no house at all. He learned to sit over the cooking pot himself, night after night, stirring the maize meal until it boiled into a jelly, because badly cooked food had nearly killed him, and he wrote plainly that this simple discipline saved his life. When his small stock of biscuit was stolen by thieves, he learned to live on whatever he could buy along the road, and he said that it is when a man must live like that, from day to day, dependent on what food he can find, that he learns to pray in earnest, "Give us this day our daily bread." And then he added, with the quiet, unbreakable trust that was the bedrock of everything in him, "But I have never wanted for any day yet, and I feel sure that I never will." Here is a man whose faith was not a Sunday feeling. It was the thing that held when everything else was stripped away. He had no comfort, no companionship most of the time, no safety, no doctor, no certainty of tomorrow's meal. And out of that emptiness he did not produce complaint. He produced praise. He looked at the psalm that says the young lions may go hungry, and he said, "As that is true, so it is also true that I have never wanted anything yet." And into that already brutal journey came the worst news of all. Word reached Mackay that two of his companions, Lieutenant Smith and Mr. O'Neill, had been murdered at an island called Uganda. The little band was already being cut down, exactly as Mackay had prophesied in that quiet room in London. Now watch what he does, because it tells you the difference between mere courage and the courage of Christ. The murdered men had friends and allies. There was talk of vengeance. Ntesa, the powerful king, was said to be preparing a fleet of 1,000 canoes to go and punish the chief who had done it. Revenge was in the air, and it would have cost countless lives. And Mackay, sick and grieving and alone, said, "I cannot be too soon on the spot to do what I can to stop this." He wrote that revenge would not help the matter in the slightest. And then he did the thing that most men could not have made themselves do. He went, courageously, to visit the very king whose people had murdered his friends, and he made peace. He made a bond of brotherhood with him, to stop the bloodshed, to keep the door open for the gospel. He buried his own grief and his own right to be angry, and he chose the harder road, the road of the peacemaker, because he was not there for himself. He was there for a whole people who had to be won from darkness to light. At last, in November of 1878, after nearly 2 years of road and river, fever and shipwreck and death, Alexander Mackay reached Uganda, the place he had chosen as his home. And here the story turns, because here he came face to face with Ntesa. Ntesa was a study in contradictions, kindly one moment and cruel the next, crafty, suspicious, surrounded by a court that groveled before him, a man who could order a life ended with a word and often did, and who was capable of acts so vile they could only be hinted at. This was the man Mackay had to reach. And he did it with wisdom that came from above, wisdom to know when to be a diplomat and when to be a prophet. On matters of the king's pride, he was careful. The king actually believed that Uganda was the most powerful country on earth, and Mackay learned when to keep a grave face and simply say, "Just so, exactly." But on the things of God, he wrote, "I do very differently." When he had to say something that went hard against heathen custom and pride and love of self, he gave his message plainly, and he told the king, "This is not mine, but God's command." He held Sunday services right there in the royal court. He read the word of God aloud to the king and the whole court in a language they understood, and he wrote that there is a mighty power in that alone. And it began to work. He read them the account of the birth of Jesus from Luke's Gospel, and when he finished, they begged him to tell them more. He read them the 51st Psalm and the Sermon on the Mount, and he said he never found so deep an interest before, nor so intelligent an understanding. And the king was so struck one day by the truth that God not only loved men, but loved them so much as to die for them, that he turned to his people and said, "This is truth I have heard today. There can be only one truth." For a season, it was springtime. The king, hearing Mackay, forbade the selling of slaves in Uganda on pain of death. When an Arab trader came offering guns and cloth in exchange for human beings, a slave for a red cloth, 2 slaves for a musket, a woman for 100 percussion caps, Mackay opposed him with everything he had. He gave the king a lecture on the human body, and asked why an organism no man can make should be sold for a rag of cloth that any man can make in a day. And the king not only refused the trade, he decreed the death penalty for selling a slave. He forbade all labor on the Sunday. He heard the evils of a life of many wives seriously debated in his own court. And then Mackay did what only Mackay could do. He set up his workshop. He got his forge going, his anvil, his lathe, his vice, and his grindstone. And the crowds came. Chiefs and slaves crowded into his smithy to watch the machinery, and the great marvel of them all, the thing they could not understand at all, was the grindstone, because they could not fathom how the wheels went round. And more precious than the forge, he set up his printing press. This was the boy from Rhynie who had set type on a toy press in a Scottish manse, now printing the word of God in the language of a Central African kingdom, teaching the people to read by holding up great sheets of type, so that they could read the truth for themselves. He said the eagerness to know and to possess the truth was far more deeply seated among those chiefs and young men than he had ever suspected. But the real Mackay, the man of unbending faith, you see most clearly in a single scene in that court. The king had a custom, borrowed from the old religion, of placing bunches of grass dipped in blood on the threshold of his court, as charms, as offerings to the old gods for good luck. And one day the medicine men came in, shaking their magic wands at the door, and Mackay watched the deference that even the king showed these evil priests, and he felt the moment was the one he had been waiting for. He did not have an opening at first. So he gathered his thoughts, and he prayed for help, and he began, gently, wisely, by praising the greatness of Uganda and its king, and how this king alone of all the kings of Central Africa was willing to hear and obey the word of God and to worship the one true God. And then he knelt down. On the floor of the court of a man who could kill him with a nod, in front of the medicine men and the whole assembly, he reached out and took hold of one of the bloody charms in his hand. And he said, "These are poor gods. Is not Jehovah in heaven far greater than all these bunches of grass? It is an insult to God to look for good luck from such things. Good luck comes from God alone." There it is. That is the whole man in one gesture. A lone Scottish engineer, kneeling on the floor of a tyrant's court, gripping a blood-soaked fetish in his fist, and calmly, fearlessly telling a king who slaughtered men for far less that his gods were nothing and Jehovah was everything. He did not shout. He did not flatter. He told the truth, because he feared God more than he feared any king on earth. Ask yourself, honestly, where in your life is there a bloody charm on the threshold that you have quietly agreed not to touch? Some idol the culture around you demands you bow to, some untruth you have decided it is wiser not to challenge, some place where you have made your peace with the darkness because confronting it would cost you? Mackay would not do it. He knelt down and took hold of the very thing, and he named it for what it was. That is what it looks like to fear God and nothing else. But you must never imagine that this life of exploits was a life of ease or of victory piled on victory. It was a life soaked in loneliness and grief. Again and again in his letters you find the same word, alone. He was alone in the workshop, alone in the fever, alone as companions died or left. And the hardest blows were still to come. In October of 1884, King Mutesa died. And his son Mwanga came to the throne, a vain youth with a vacillating, unstable disposition, and under him the sky over Uganda turned black. Mwanga's suspicion of white men had been poisoned by the whispers of Arab traders, who told him the missionaries were really political agents come to take his country and overthrow his throne. And Mwanga believed them. The teaching that had once been welcomed was now forbidden. No one was allowed to come near the missionaries under pain of death, though many still came, secretly, at night, hungry for the truth. And then the killing began. In 1885, a bishop named Hannington was traveling toward Uganda to strengthen the mission. And Mwanga, in a fit of fear and madness, ordered him murdered, along with some 50 of his porters. Mackay and his companion Ash learned of it from eyewitnesses, and they were helpless, and they knew that they themselves were under a similar sentence, and could expect their own arrest at any moment. And when the king's own head page, a Christian man and a most faithful servant, dared to tell Mwanga that it was wrong to kill the bishop, that his father Mutesa would never have done such a thing, the king ordered that faithful young man to be burned alive. That was the beginning. Already, some months before, 3 young readers, the first martyrs of Uganda, had been condemned to the flames simply for their faith. And in May of 1886, the full fury broke. It began with what Mackay called an act of splendid disobedience. A Christian page who absolutely refused to be made the victim of an unspeakable abomination the king demanded of him. The boy was a Christian, and he was threatened with instant death, but he would not yield. And the king's rage turned into a decree. These Christians, he said, are disobedient, and they learn rebellion from the white man. I shall kill them all. And he tried. Bands were sent out through the land to catch and kill. About a dozen were hacked to pieces on the very first day, their bodies left lying along the roads. Over 30 were seized. And on a single day, at a place whose name is now written in heaven, more than 30 of those young believers were bound together and slowly roasted alive on one great murderous pyre, for no crime but that they loved Jesus Christ and would not deny him. Mackay was there, in the country, and he was helpless to stop it. He watched nearly all his best friends arrested suddenly and murdered almost before his very eyes. He wrote home in agony that they could not yet realize the awful loss they had sustained. And he wrote a sentence that should be carved on the conscience of the comfortable church. He said, "It is not now the cry of the heathen for the gospel, but the eloquent, unremitting appeal of severed limbs and writhing bodies for help and deliverance." Think of what it cost him to stay. He had given 14 years to these people. He had taught them, printed the word for them, loved them, prayed with them. And now he was watching them burn, and there was nothing his hands could do to save them. The king held him and Ash as hostages, afraid that England would come avenging the bishop's death, unwilling to let them go and unwilling to let them work. And still, in the middle of that horror, Mackay held on to God. He wrote that they were, if possible, more especially in God's hands in the time of trouble than in peace and prosperity. He wrote, "We may say, Ebenezer, hitherto the Lord has helped us." He said it is only when we come to the very end of ourselves that we see the folly of trusting anything else. And here is the wonder of it, the thing you must not miss. The blood of those young martyrs was not the end of the church in Uganda. It was the seed of it. The persecution could not stop the gospel. The invincible leaven, as Mackay called it, was still at work, and many were being secretly added to the church even while the fires burned. And within a few short years, everything turned. Mwanga was driven from his own throne. There was civil war, terrible bloodshed, Christians and others fighting for their lives against armies sent to annihilate them, and far more falling in those battles than had died in all the king's persecutions. And then, against every earthly expectation, the tide turned completely. The Christians who had been hunted and burned and scattered became the victors. The men who had fled for their lives, having lost wives, children, homes, and country, with nothing but the faith in their hearts, rose up, and the power of that whole kingdom fell into the hands of men who rejoiced to be called Christian. Mackay looked at it and could hardly believe it. "Shall a nation be born in a day?" he asked. And he answered his own question. "It is born." He had sown in tears, and now, from a great distance, he was watching the beginning of a harvest that would one day make Uganda one of the great strongholds of the Christian faith on the entire African continent. The men who lit those pyres are a footnote of horror. The boys they burned are a foundation. That is how the kingdom of God advances. It does not advance in spite of the cost. It advances through it. Through all of these final years, Mackay had been driven from Uganda itself and had established himself down at the south of the Great Lake, at a place called Uzambiro. And there the losses kept coming, relentless, one after another. A bishop named Parker arrived, and Mr. Blackburn with him, and within a fortnight of each other, both were suddenly struck down with fever and died. Mackay dug their graves himself, under a tree in the jungle, and read the funeral service in the local tongue, and piled great heaps of stones over each grave, and planted a fence around the little plot. Twice in 14 days he had performed the sacred duty of closing the eyes of a dying brother and commending him to the Savior. He wrote that it had indeed been a heavy time of sorrow. And then he wrote the thing that made him Mackay. He said, "But every one gone is a step nearer victory. The end to be gained is worth the price paid. The redemption of the world cost infinitely more." He was left alone again. And what did the last survivor of the great expedition do, alone at the edge of a lake in the heart of Africa? He worked. He retranslated the Gospel of John into the language of Uganda, so the people would have the word. He went out into the forest and felled timber with his own hands and built a four-wheeled wagon to carry it. He made bricks, 10,000 of them in a fortnight, to build a house in which to construct a boat, because, as he said with the simple honesty of a workman, mission boats do not grow of themselves. They have to be built, every inch of them. And even in that, he saw the hand of God, that the trees had been growing for ages of the Lord's planting, and as he felled them, he liked to think the Lord had ordained them for this very purpose. And even now, spent, alone, grieving, worn down by 14 years of fever, when the letters came from home telling him to come back, to rest, to come home at last, he would not. To the secretary of the mission he wrote, near the very end of his life, "But what is this you write, come home? Surely now, in our terrible dearth of workers, it is not the time for anyone to desert his post. Send us only your first 20 men, and I may be tempted to come to help you find the second 20. He would not desert his post. That was the whole of it. He had said, 14 years before, when I fall, send the next man. Now he was the last man, and he was still refusing to leave a gap in the line. There was one last glimpse the world got of him. The famous explorer Stanley, the very man whose letter had first drawn the mission to Uganda, arrived at Uzambiro with his party, including some of his officers, broken down in body and mind, prostrated by fever, embittered and exhausted from a terrible journey. And Mackay received them. One of those officers, a man named Jeffson, later wrote a letter that survives, and it is one of the most beautiful testimonies ever written about a missionary. He said they arrived a handful of broken-down, embittered men, and that through Mackay's kindness they left restored to health, with a fresh zest and love for their work. He wrote about the morning they departed, how Mackay walked part of the way with them and wished them Godspeed, and how one's whole heart went out to him. That lonely figure, he wrote, standing on the brow of the hill, waving farewell to us, will ever remain vividly in my mind. That is the last picture. A lonely figure on a hilltop in Africa, waving goodbye to men he had saved, men he had poured his own dwindling strength into, sending them on their way with a blessing. And then turning back, alone, to his post. His last message to the world, dictated at Uzambiro in the beginning of 1890, was not a complaint or a farewell. It was a trumpet blast. He looked at a Uganda where a nation was being born, helpless and newborn and in the most critical condition imaginable, and he cried out across the sea. "You sons of England," he said, "here is a field for your energies. Bring your highest education and your greatest talents. You will find scope for them all. You men of God who have resolved to devote your lives to the souls of men, here is the proper field for you." He begged them not to send 2 or 3, but 20. And he grieved over the church at home that squabbled over trifling points of doctrine and government while millions went down to the grave without a hope, its candlestick in danger of being removed while it argued over infinitesimals. Where are the volunteers, he asked. Where are the unselfish heroes and heroines who give their lives gladly that Africa may be evangelized? On the 8th of February, 1890, at 11 o'clock at night, Alexander Mackay went home. A severe attack of fever, the same African giant that had thrown him down so many times over 14 years, took him at last. He had been 4 days and nights delirious with the malaria. Only a week before, he had been busy and kind, setting up a sick young colleague for the journey home to England, personally helping to pack the man's things. And on the very morning that colleague was to leave, they found Mackay had not come out of his room, and went in, and found him taken with the fever. In 5 days he was gone. He had never once left the shores of Africa in nearly 14 years. From the day he landed to the day he died, he did not take a single furlough, a single rest, a single trip home. He gave every hour, every skill, every ounce of strength, and finally his very life, to a people not his own, in a land that took nearly everyone it touched. When the news reached England, it produced a burst of admiration and grief that astonished even the mission that sent him. The newspapers ran leading articles. One called him the St. Paul of Uganda. Colonel Grant, the great explorer who had first helped discover that country, wrote that a score of men would never make a Mackay. His fellow officer wrote that his death was an irreparable loss to Africa, whose cause he had so deeply at heart and for whom he worked so devotedly. And from Uganda itself, from the very people he had bled for, came a letter written by the first convert Mackay had led to Christ in that land. To all the Christians in England, it began, "I am your friend, the first convert and follower of Mr. Mackay in Uganda." And it pleaded with them, through their tears, to send more teachers, because their beloved Mackay had gone to his rest, and there were so many, so very many, who wanted to read and to know the truth, and there was no one left who could teach them as he had. They buried him under the African sky, at Uzambiro, where he fell. Now let this story do to you what it was meant to do. Alexander Mackay was not a superman. He was a boy who lost his mother, a young man tempted by a comfortable career, a missionary shaken by fear, worn down by loneliness, grieving over open graves, sick almost to death more times than he could count. He was frail, and he knew he was frail. But he had settled one thing, in a drawing office in Berlin, long before he ever saw Africa. He had settled that if Christianity is worth anything, it is worth everything. And once a man settles that, there is nothing left that can turn him back. Not fever. Not shipwreck. Not the murder of his friends. Not a tyrant's court. Not 30 bodies burning on a pyre. Not 14 years of loneliness. Not even a letter from home saying, "You have done enough. Come home and rest." His answer was always the same. It is not the time for anyone to desert his post. Where is your post? God has not called most of us to die of fever in the African bush. But he has called every one of us to a life that means everything, not a Christianity of the comfortable middle that Mackay despised, but one that has laid itself down. He has given you a place to stand, a family, a workplace, a street, a moment in history, and he is asking whether you will hold it or desert it. He is asking whether you fear him more than you fear the bloody charm on the threshold. He is asking whether your faith is a Sunday feeling or the bedrock that holds when everything else is stripped away. And maybe, as you have listened to this, you have realized that somewhere along the way you drifted, that the fire that once burned in you for God has gone out, and you have quietly made your peace with the darkness, and the middle ground you told yourself was safe has become a place far from him. If that is you, hear this. The same God who kept Mackay's mother's prayers, who answered a young man's cry that his heart burned for Africa, who turned the ashes of 30 martyrs into the birth of a nation, that God is calling you back tonight. It is not too late. The candlestick has not yet been removed. Come home. Come back to the God of the Bible, the God who so loved men that he died for them, the one truth, of which the dying king said, "There can be only one truth." Come back to him. He is still on the brow of the hill, waving, waiting, calling you by name. If this story has stirred something in your heart, do not let it fall to the ground. Take a moment right now and let this channel know. Like this video so that more people will find it. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that a life poured out for God is never wasted. And if you have not yet subscribed, subscribe today and turn on the notifications so that you never miss another story of the men and women who spent everything for the sake of the King. There are so many more of these heroes waiting to be told, and this channel exists for one reason: to stir the hearts of men and women back to the God of the Bible. And if you are watching this and you have wandered far from God, let today be the day you come home. He has never stopped waiting for you. Before you go, tell everyone in the comments where in the world you are watching this from. Let us see how far the story of Alexander Mackay has traveled, and let us pray for one another across every nation, tribe, and tongue. Until the next story, may the God of Mackay give you grace to hold why.